We're here for a council work session, March 8th, 2023. The mayor is out of town on city business, so as council president, I will be convening the meeting today. So with that, call this meeting to order. And good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for the meeting on the public webcasts and meeting materials webpage. Thank you again for joining us. Okay, the first order of business, I think we'll change council assignments. Okay, so the first order of business is
Randy does all.
I'm taking shots. Well, you know, I mean, I think you did originate the drive it like you stole it comment.
Absolutely.
7-1 vote.
So the first work session item before us with possible action is an ordinance concerning flood hazard areas, amending sections 9.0500, 9.6705, 9.6706, 9.6707, 9.6708, and 9.6709 of the Eugene Code 1971, and providing an effective date. And with that, I'll turn it over to the city manager to introduce this subject.
Thank you, Councilor Groves. And I'm actually just going to turn it right over to Jack to do that.
Okay, thanks so much. Wait for the presentation.
It's behind you.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks so much. So I'm Jack Blackham. I am the permitting and floodplain manager over at Public Works Engineering. I'm the project manager for the floodplain development code amendments, which are required for the National Flood Insurance Program compliance or minimum standards for floodplain development. Jeff Gepper is here to my right. He's our senior land use code lead. Emily Jerome from the city attorney's office helped on this, and Jennifer Willer, the city engineer. So just to recap this, the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, is overseen by FEMA federally. It enables property owners, businesses to purchase flood insurance. It also requires that we, local governments, enact floodplain ordinances that minimize future flood losses. So as I said, FEMA oversees the NFIP federally. Department of Land Conservation and Development oversee the National Flood Insurance Program within the state of Oregon. And they also wrote the model code on which we based the proposed code amendments, which comply with the minimum standards from FEMA. So the city has been a participant since 1986 within the National Flood Insurance Program. We are also a participant in a voluntary program, which is kind of a subsect of the National Flood Insurance Program called the Community Rating System. There's a lot of work that we do as a floodplain program, and what that ends up in is an automatic discount on flood insurance premiums for anybody who gets flood insurance, both residents inside and outside of the floodplain. And so the code amendments were based on meeting the core tenets of the minimum requirements. In some case, this meant just keeping existing code, but updating the language per the model code provided by DLCD. Other cases, this meant adopting new items. So these are the new items that you see before you. There's notification of boundary changes. That's when the UGB changes, that's an internal city process item. There's definitions and assessments and determinations of substantial improvement and substantial damage and improvements. The first item on that, definitions and clarifications, is for the applicant. The second part, assessments and determinations, is an internal city process item. There are new floodplain specific construction standards for several items. One of those would be garages as an example. So if your garage is attached to your primary structure or detached to your primary structure, there are development standards for those. And then the final one is a reasonably safe requirement for different flood zones. So there's a flood zone where FEMA has not, in their mapping, has not provided a base flood elevation, which is kind of the hallmark, what we need for development permits. But when FEMA hasn't provided that base flood elevation, we've added a clause for that lowest floor being 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. So once landscaping has been completed, that would be an adjacent grade, and the lowest floor has to be 2 feet above that. So we have to work through that in plan review and those sorts of items. And then these are some optional updates. So city staff felt that it was important to include a couple of these. The first 2 bullet points deal with letter of map changes. And as a recap, those are letters of map changes are FEMA processes that have been provided by FEMA in acknowledgement that their maps aren't perfect. Some properties get inadvertently added due to the scale of mapping. So we've added 2 items that reflect that. We've added language that says the applicant is required to provide all of the submission and all the technical data for us to review before it goes on to FEMA for approval. And then we also, for certain letters of map changes, there's a community acknowledgement form, and we don't have to sign that until we felt that the applicant has shown that they meet all of the applicable federal and state requirements that go along with that permit. And then the final one is a continuance of a 1 foot of freeboard requirement. And as a recap, freeboard is just a margin of safety. It's a 1 foot additional safety. And this is already an existing code. So we're just maintaining what is already there. And this is a requirement for our community rating system. So that gets us a certain class. Again, I don't know if I mentioned the number, but that the CRS rating gets us a 15% discount on those flood insurance premiums. And then these are some items that are not changing with the ordinance. So the flood maps are not changing. Those set the floodplain boundaries where this all applies. Those aren't changing with the proposed code amendments. Existing flood insurance policies and the mandatory purchase of flood insurance requirements set by FEMA, that's not changing. Those flood insurance policies are not changing. And then any existing letter of map changes. So anybody who has gone through that process, removed themselves, those letters of map change are still valid with the proposed code amendments. And then finally, just really quickly on the procedural process, we went through Planning Commission. We came here on January 11th for a work session. We had a public hearing for this topic on February 21st, didn't receive any public testimony. And now we are here, and I think you have a single motion in your packet. And I'm happy to answer any questions, provide some clarifications, anything.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Are there questions or comments from council? Councilor Zelenka.
Yeah, nice job, Jack. This is a complicated thing you did, and it was very clear. 2 questions. One, is this an all or nothing thing? We have to adopt all of what FEMA recommended, or can we object to 1 or 2 things? Or
there are the core items, they're minimum standards. So we have to comply. Department of Land Conservation and Development in 2020 came back and said we have to apply and adopt all minimum standards in order to remain a participant. So the minimum standards are an all or nothing.
Yeah, and DLCD checked with FEMA and they said, yes, you're good to go with these. Yep. So if we adopt them, we're good with FEMA and DLCD.
Yep.
The second one is about maps. Okay. So, and with the recent controversy over maps on wildfires, do these maps, they're readily accessible on our website?
They are.
They're hard to find, by the way.
That's good feedback. To be clear, that the maps aren't changing, but FEMA flood maps are available on the website, and the preliminary maps, as you know, FEMA's updating the maps right now, and those are available on the project webpage. I've actually included a link on slide 2, I believe, and I can also get you more information.
Okay. On
the maps, if you would.
And when will they be done with the update?
We expect 2024.
Okay.
The new maps. Again, nothing's changing with these code amendments.
Right. Shouldn't be that much of a big change in there.
We'll come back to this body when those maps are ready to adopt.
Right. Okay.
But if you want more information on the maps, I can certainly provide that.
No, I just like maps. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Clark.
Thank you, sir. Acting Mayor.
Not acting mayor.
I get to call him what I like, brother. Anyway, I want to say, first of all, thank you for the report and thank you for the work. I want to just double check a couple of things as I understand them. This is an application to change in FEMA standards, correct?
This was a requirement that came from the Department of Land Conservation and Development as a actor of FEMA.
Got it. Okay. I just want to double check a couple of things that I thought I heard you say, just for the sake of constituents that may be listening, watching, or otherwise. Several of my constituents are very close to bodies of water, and as a result, this is very interesting to them. So I'm understanding that our vote today doesn't actually change any flood maps as they currently exist. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it doesn't put somebody into any particular property owner into a flood zone that was not in one previously. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
And it doesn't change assessed heights so that somebody who may have one type of flood insurance has a more significant liability today by voting on this. Am I correct about that too?
That's correct.
Excellent news. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure.
Thank you. Are there any other counselors with comments or questions?
I have one more.
Okay. Micah.
Jack, so without this changes in compliance with these new requirements, people in Eugene would not be able to get flood insurance through FEMA and would not be eligible for flood relief if a flood, God forbid, should ever happen. Correct?
That's
So
correct.
if we don't do this, the impact is putting at risk a heck of a lot of people with regard to flood insurance and recovery funds.
Correct. Yes. Yep.
Okay.
The federal disaster, we're also potentially ineligible for federal disaster funds from flooding if we don't maintain our participation.
Right. So good. Thanks.
Thank
The
you.
reason to support it.
There's nobody else. I have a question. I'm not sure who to direct it to. First of all, thank you very much for the information and the work. I think this is very important. This should be built into, which it already is, our emergency plans. For the city manager, are municipalities eligible for flood insurance?
Property owners, if structures, yes, as the city, we could have flood insurance, yes, on a structure.
Is that something we are considering for the new city hall, which will be in a floodplain?
Yeah, I think we will need to come back to that because we're sort of in the due diligence and trying to understand what that means and what we would or wouldn't do. We're self-insured, so I'm not clear on that yet. But
We're self-insured, but that would be a catastrophic
Right.
loss that would probably exceed our ability to cover something. I would like more information eventually when the time is right.
Okay.
And also a little separate from this, but it is germane. I don't want to do a work session poll right now because I know our staff are just maxed out between state imposed work and our own work. But at some point, I would like us to dig in deeper to the dams that are upstream from us and learn more about the seismic resiliency. I'm serving on a DEQ working group right now, advisory committee on bulk fuel storage facilities. There's 3 of them in Oregon, 1 of them just outside of Eugene, and they're all in floodplains and they're all on soil that will be prone to liquefaction. And I would like to have some discussions more about that and how we better prepare ourselves and how we lobby for hardening and reinforcing of the dams that we rely on to control floods.
I second that motion.
It wasn't a motion, Councilor Clark.
Yeah, and-
I know. I'm just being a smart.
Okay.
And what I mentioned, I think I mentioned to you just a little bit earlier is actually I have an email with some information links and a video on this topic that is sitting in my drafts. I meant to hit send on last night. And so I'll hit send when we leave this work session.
Yeah, that's a great excuse. I think I'll coin that in the future. Thank you very much. If that is all we have to come before us on this issue, let's transition to our second work session. Thank you.
We have a-
Oh, excuse me.
So is there a motion, Counselor?
He wants to.
Well, you get what you pay for. So with that said,
Because our
Council Vice President, are you in a position to make a motion or should we defer that to somebody?
I'm
who's
happy to
here?
make a motion, Counselor.
Great, thank you.
Mayor for a day, council president, whatever we want to call
Council
you.
President.
Thank you, Randy. Move to adopt an ordinance concerning flood hazard areas, amending sections 9.0500, 9.6705, 9.6706, 9.6707, 9.6708, and 9.6709 of the Eugene City Code 1971, and providing an effective date as included in attachment A.
Second.
All in favor? Councilor Keating, is your hand up? It's
Yeah.
mid-staff. Okay, that looks like the passes unanimously. And if I haven't missed anything else, why don't we transition to the next work session?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Give a minute for staff to transition.
Just turn it right over to Catherine.
Queen?
Mayor on duty.
It's a TV show.
Oh, so that's, okay. I get what you're saying now. Okay, our next work session is a House Bill 3115 overview and next steps. City Attorney.
Good afternoon. We're going to pick up where we left off last week when I gave you an overview of House Bill 3115. So we're picking up with an opportunity to talk about some proposed and potential amendments to the city code. Very quick reminder of what 3115 requires and so why we're having this discussion today. I'm just going to give you read the one kind of key provision in there. House Bill 3115 provides any city or county law that regulates the acts of sitting, lying, sleeping, or keeping warm and dry outdoors on public property that is open to the public must be objectively reasonable as to time, place, and manner with regards to persons experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to jump right in and just start giving you a very high overview of what you have in your attachment A to your AIS, which is a series of potential code amendments. Real big picture, these proposed code amendments are would be changing the current code provision of prohibited camping that prohibits camping on any public property. And the proposed code amendments would be very specific location instead of the any. And it was specifically identified public property. And the proposed code amendments are based on three overarching issues and goals. One being accessibility, the second being public health, and the third being safety. So if you wonder, you probably looked at the exhibit attachment D, which is the examples from all the other cities. And if your question was how do you cull it? How do you come up with what is being proposed? Those were our guiding principles in doing that: health, safety, accessibility. So, and real quick, for those three items, what you see in the proposed code amendments and how those lines are drawn regarding accessibility, that's the provisions that are intended to and designed to keep our sidewalks, shared use paths, and access ways with a minimum clear width to allow access for people within our community with disabilities that need to access those. So those are the provisions intended for that. Regarding health, you see a handful of code amendments, not to specifically to the prohibited camping provision, but just around discharging of waste and storing of waste and other things like that within our public way and our stormwater system. And there is one code amendment proposed that's a prohibition on camping within a certain number of feet of a waterway for those same reasons, because of the collection and the health issues with that. And then lastly, regarding safety, there's a handful of proposed amendments to the prohibited camping provisions that relate to prohibiting camping that within or very near areas that have that are intended for and have a heavy use of vehicles. And it's either proposed as an outright prohibition of camping where those vehicles are, or a requirement. There just needs to be a minimum buffer between the vehicle moving and the location of the campsite. So that's all of the detail is within attachment A. I wanted to give you as much time as you can to talk about it, ask questions, see where you're all going with that. And today, really what I'm hoping happens in that I get out of this meeting is some just next steps desires out of this council. And you have a handful of them and you saw them within council options. So really what we're hoping to leave here today with is an understanding of, do you want to move the proposed code amendments that are set out in attachment A, directing city manager to draft an ordinance and schedule a public hearing on that? Maybe is your desire to have a separate set of code amendments to draft an ordinance on and have a public hearing? Or do you want to have another work session and talk about this more? So those are you have many different options available to you. So with all of that, and also I want to say Public Works Director Matt Rodriguez is here, Police Chief Chris Skinner, and Assistant City Manager Christy Hammett are all here. And I haven't done this alone, so a lot of support from people, and they're all here to help as well. So.
Thank you, City Attorney. And with that, we'll open up for questions and comments from council. Councilor Semple.
Couple of quick first questions or comments. I think 5 feet from the waterway is way too low. I mean, I'm 5'4", and that's just, if I lay down between the campsite and the water, that's not enough. We're worried about our riparian zones, rivers, canals, mill race. I just think that's too close. And so it's good that we have a really specific list of where you can't camp. But I'm wondering, what does that leave where you can camp? And probably we don't have this data, but I'd like to know what we think the shift will be from all these you can't camp here to the unknown you can camp here. Do we have any kind of map of where it'll be illegal, where it'll be legal, which we probably don't want to put out, but it's going to be a question of, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this. What can we do? Because people don't always think through a list of prohibitions. They just want to know what they can do. So if going through the list of prohibitions becomes onerous, people are going to ignore them. So I'm just wondering about what it's going to happen to the places where it's are allowed. That's it for now.
Are you going to try and answer that, City Attorney, or do you want?
I don't have an answer for that. And so I don't know what type of data right now. I mean, it's interesting because right now the current code provision prohibits it everywhere. And so we may have some data of where there's some hot spots generally. I just don't know, but we can look into that and see what information we can get you. And since these were just potential code amendments and I didn't know what the discussion was going to be, I didn't want to come into over prepared and sense that this is what you were planning to do. So if you do move forward this, we can get you information based on this as well.
Wonderful.
Are you through?
Yes, for the moment.
Councilor Clark, and then Councilor Zelenka, and then Councilor Evans.
Thanks, sir. General questions for the city's attorney. My understanding here is that these all apply to city-owned land. Am I correct in that?
It's yes.
So county-owned, state-owned, privately owned don't fall under the jurisdiction of these ordinance changes. Yes, correct?
Well, privately owned property, most definitely. We don't have the authority to regulate other governmental entities' properties such as ODOT. When it and Chief Skinner, if you want to speak to that, I don't believe we definitely are not. The ODOT has their own rules. The county has their own rules regarding what it is and isn't allowed on their property. So these are really intended to be just regulating city public owned property. But if I'm incorrect, Chief, please jump in.
No, you're not incorrect. This is, we treat anything outside of publicly owned city property, we treat just like any other private property and would ask people to submit a trespass letter on file if we're seeing a lot of issues, and be involved in an interactive process for us to be able to remove people that are technically trespassed from the property. The railroad's a good example of that, where they'll have a
Right.
trespass letter on file. There's a little bit of a disconnect with them where they believe just by virtue of having a letter on file, that means that we should do whatever we want to do with their property. We believe that we should engage them in every time to make sure that what we're doing is something that they're willing to support in the event that there's a prosecution. So it would be every other non-city of Eugene owned public property would go through that same process.
Gotcha. Okay. And last and separately, Catherine, authority and application here. The county is our area's health authority. Am I correct when I say that in general terms?
Yes.
So does the county have the capacity to create specifically an ordinance that deals with public health that would apply to city property?
Do they have
Do they have the authority to say you can do this based on community health or public health? You can or cannot do the following things. Can the county do that?
boy, I'm so hesitant just to say yes or no. So, because it's fairly broad.
Right.
Generally, yes. They are the public health authority for this county. So I would want to, so generally, yes, as the public health authority, they have authority and regulate that area within our community. I would want to be more specific and know what they're proposing to say whether I think that there's a direct line between their general authority and what they're proposing to do.
Okay, so as it pertains to some of the things that you have listed when it comes to dealing with public camping, is there anything you can think of off the top of your head based on effects of 3115 or otherwise where the county as the public health authority would not have jurisdiction to make any particular rule as it pertains to health related ordinances within the city of Eugene public property?
Well, I think there's the kind of the separate paths here is what our chapter 4 is an exercise of our police authority and the regulation of our public property, what can and can't be done in our public property. That isn't the public health authority nature of the county. That's not a police enforcement authority. So that's where I'm probably not getting really great answers, but that's the disconnect between those two.
But they lean on state authority for that, right? I mean, because they're the public health agency of the state, correct?
They are the public health agency of the state, yes.
And what, if you know, I don't know, what manner of enforcement capacity the county has under that authority?
I don't know. So if they had some requirement as the public health authority that, whatever requirement it is, that was the first thing that came to my mind when you were asking this question. Right. I know how our police authority works. I don't know what their enforcement authority is or what sort of compliance mechanism they have around that. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Councilor Zelenka.
Yeah, I had similar questions. I'll run through them. I get what this is trying to do, and I understand the threading the needle that we have to do to comply with the new law. But I don't have a good, clear picture of what it looks like today and what it looks like after we do this, and how what becomes legal and what becomes illegal and where. Kind of the same question that Emily had. So like camping in parks or natural areas, for instance. I know we went from replacing a general prohibition on camping to specific locations. And the specific locations are identified because of health, safety, and access. And that makes sense. But that's So that takes the universe of all the places you can camp and kind of constrains it, but I don't understand, I don't know what that looks like.
I can give you, so I think it's hard to list out all the places that aren't included in the list of where it's prohibited. So I understand that. But just to answer the one question I heard.
Do a map.
Well, I couldn't, but yes, theoretically there could be a map. But maybe. But I want to answer your question about parks and open spaces. House Bill 3115 states that if a city or county has a law that regulates sitting, sleeping, lying, keeping warm and dry on property that is opened to the public, you have a code provision that very specifically regulates the hours of parks. And we have park hours and that apply to parks and open space. They're not open to the public. They're not open to anybody. So it's not upending all of that. If the property is closed to the public, the fact that that piece of property is not listed here it's still closed to the public. It doesn't make it open to camping, but closed to everybody else.
So like a park's closed from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m.
They are closed.
Closed to everybody.
Closed to everybody.
Yeah,
that's correct.
Okay. And then there's another section on parking lots and on-street parking spaces. What's the rationale for that? How broadly can that be applied to other kinds of places?
The on-street parking spaces is really that curb to curb. And so it's just one, instead of just saying curb to curb, it was just trying to be a little bit more clear what that curb to curb covers. So it's the travel lane, it's the bike lane, it's the on-street parking spaces. So that was it was just kind of drilling down what the curb to curb area is. Parking lots, that it can be described narrowly or generally, but it would include it's only publicly owned parking lots, again, because we're not regulated in other ways. But it would be places where people are, like over parks and things like that, unless it's explicitly prohibited. I mean, we have our car camping program is taking place in publicly owned parking lots right now. So it wouldn't all of a sudden make those unlawful. This is areas that are not specifically designated for that.
Is the rationale because it then prohibits the use of what it's intended for? If there's someone camping there, you can't park or you can't use it as a parking lot.
It's not, a parking lot is intended to have cars moving around in it and for cars to, so there is a very clear safety component there. And we had an unfortunate death not that long, a couple of years ago, with a woman in the Kinko's parking lot. So those very specifically have a safety component, and there is a practicality component also, but that wasn't the driving force of that provision at all.
Right. I had the same concern. I circled on attachment A, the prohibition of camping 5 feet from a waterway. We have setbacks all over the Willamette Greenway that are 75 feet. We just approved one that would keep on the land swap 200 feet in the new area next to the steam plant that we're getting from the U of O. 5 feet just seems like, especially when you're talking about health and health in particular. And I guess that relates back to the 4D, which is draining or causing a permit to drain sewage, gray water, blah, 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 from vehicle waste from holding tanks, and so if we're trying to maintain the health of our waterways, like the Willamette River, 5 feet seems like wholly inappropriate amount of space or distance from the waterway.
Mm-hmm. We certainly, and Matt, if you want to speak to this, if there's another number that sounds better, I wanted to have a jumping off voice exactly for this discussion. How far you want it from there is absolutely something that is appropriate for you to be discussing and picking. It didn't feel terribly appropriate for me to pick a giant number and then have you grapple with it.
So that's good. My feedback, because water setbacks are for a whole multitude of reasons, some of which is related to health. So the What's your confidence factor in all of these changes, given what's been going on with the courts?
There are so many unknowns with House Bill 3115, so many undefined terms. And there hasn't been a single case related to 3115. So I can't really speculate. What I can say is the very clear reason why these are being proposed as they are proposed is that they are very clearly related to three very clear and reasonable intents: public health, safety, accessibility.
Right.
So what you don't see in here is some kind of abstract, just not here because. You don't have that included in this. It's not part of the proposal. So from that perspective, I am confident that we are proposing amendments that have a very clear, reasonable, rational, and important public interest. Whether that is what the court will look to, I don't know. There are no cases interpreting 3115.
Yeah, I'll need a second round. Well, and with my final question to the chief, which is, how the heck are you going to enforce this, chief? I mean, this is going to be a lot of gray area.
Well, it's an excellent question. It begs the question how we've been doing enforcing what we have now to begin with. There's, certainly resources are constrained and limited. I think there's some ways to get a little more intentional around the resources that will be paying particular attention to this issue, instead of just asking patrol to absorb this as yet another thing that we're asking them to do. Our housing support officers are a good example of a resource that can get really, really good at this and better understand this nuance. And as we work through this, I think we have a real interest in making it as understandable and as clean as possible when it comes to boundaries and where you can and can't do certain things. And we don't have to look very far outside of the downtown to look how confusing it can be for people to understand what's enforceable and where. So we'll be paying attention to this and working closely with Catherine and others within the city to figure out a way to make this easy to decipher, and then actually have staff that become experts on this instead of asking everybody to pay attention to these issues.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councilor Evans, followed by Councilor Ye.
Okay. I'm almost thoroughly confused by this for several reasons, but maybe you could help clarify some of this for me. So if I go to attachment B and I'm looking at section 10, subsection A, up to 15 persons may sleep overnight in vehicles as terms defined in subsection 1A of this section. So are we looking at, for example, you could have 15 people sleeping in a camper?
Okay.
Or would it be 15 people that would be sleeping in, say, 3 separate vehicles or 4 separate vehicles? I mean, how do we determine that? And then who's going to be responsible for that count? Would that be the police, or would that be some other entity that would be checking on these particular sites? That's one question. And then the other question is, for me, is does this add to the stock of rest stops that we already are authorizing? Would that expand the number of rest stops that we have, or would it be more constrained?
So I'll jump in and I'll answer. I think I'll answer both of the questions will probably get answered in together. Attachment B is your current code. So nothing in attachment B is are part of the amendments. I set that out there so you could kind of see what exists now. So the 4.816 and subsection 10, all of those are your current exceptions.
That's exactly what we do now.
It's exactly what you do now. So these all, so 4.816, 1 through, you got a lot of them, 10 are your existing programs that you've kind of added onto over the years that are exceptions to the prohibited camping code provisions. So the subsection 10, that's your current rest stop program. And we have administrative rules that implement this. And so this is the same program. The one thing that I suggested you could do as part of these amendments, you have an uncodified dusk to dawn program that was adopted around 2017, I think it was. And it just doesn't happen to be listed amongst your 10 exceptions to your prohibited camping prohibition. That was the one potential amendment that you could make to your permitted overnight sleeping provisions, to clearly add a subsection 11 that has your dusk to dawn program. So those are the only, so there's nothing with the proposed amendments to 4.815, which is your prohibited camping provisions, that would have any impact on what can and can't be done with your rest stop programs, your safe sleep prep, none of that. Those are separate, and those are clear exceptions to the prohibited camping provision.
So we could codify our dusk to dawn.
People, can we actually get into services and getting housed somewhere? It's small. So it's not that I think we're going to have more campers, but if we're going to enforce all of these things, I'm just concerned about overwhelming our already stretched system. And if we're not going to enforce it, then it's pretty meaningless. I'm still concerned about taking all these, you can't camp here, and getting a map and, you know, diagonal lines, all the places that are restricted. And now you've got a map of where you can camp. And if I was camping, I'd be on that team doing that. So what are we going to do? Do we think there's going to be places that are now going to be overburdened? And, you know, do we have a limit of how many people can camp on an island that's, you know, not 5 feet from the road? I don't see anything addressing those numbers. So I'm really wondering how we're going to deal with that.
And I think that those are all reasonable questions. I'll just real briefly speak to the enforcement piece. We have many new kind of levers involved in all of this work that's happening. So it is being thought about and by a lot of people that are out doing this work on how it can be resourced in a way that makes sense and also that it's effective. And it's being looked at actually in different places within our organization. I'll just give you a really quick example. Very recently, the city prosecutor's office working with municipal court have been using community court more broadly. And now all trespass, regardless of where a trespass occurs within our city, is eligible to go to community court. And it's those kind of thoughts with people that are working within these systems that are going to help us just figure out how enforcement will work in an effective way. Regarding the issue of the spacing and those things, those are all, you'll see, those are being kind of brought out in other cities as also regulations, because it's a place regulation. When I was drafting this, when I was talking to people, I see this a little iteratively, because it's very hard to anticipate all of the potential that could roll out. So will this be the last time you see this? Probably not. It will need to be a somewhat iterative process. I know we all have a lot on the agenda, so that's not the best thing for me to say, but to me, getting something in place and then potentially needing to come back and tweak it, like you're saying, that's the way I approached it.
Well, we have a lot of density considerations and we want to increase it. So I could see camping spots really being overwhelmed by a lot of people. We've already seen it happen in places that seem they're not going to be enforced. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Leach, followed by me at the end.
Thank you. I think, like some of my colleagues, I'm also having a hard time translating this into what's actually going to happen at the end. Does this improve the experience or lives of the people that we're talking about, the unhoused? Does it prevent, these sweeps of their campsites and the removal of their property? I think I'd like to see more information about the intent and the expected outcomes of some of these things. I think the intent is there, but I'd like to see more in depth on that. And nobody likes to talk about, the garbage situation, but we have this prohibited activities addition about debris and waste. But how are we going to manage that? If we're saying you cannot put your things or your trash here, what are we doing about it as a city? Are we putting in more dumpsters? Are we putting in somewhere where people can actually self-manage that? Or, how are we seeing this actually happening on the ground? So I would like to see, City Attorney, you mentioned more than just the Dusk to Dawn program ordinance, that there might be a packet of ordinances or is that just the only one?
It's, some of them still have sunset dates. The Dusk to Dawn is the only one out there remaining now. The council voted and lifted the sunset, so it is permanent and there's no reason not to put it in the code. The other programs that you have currently have sunset dates. Those are separate policy decisions that you need to make as a council.
I would like to see all of that put together, every policy or ordinance that we have around kind of this topic, so that we can look at it in a more comprehensive way, as well as have some of our other service providers talk to many of them. And I feel like we aren't doing as much as we could to really look at the whole picture and make sure that we're not siloing people and organizations and our response to, what this is trying to address. So I would like to see another work session to get more information. And then, I also agree about the waterway, but I don't know that 75 feet is the right number. I don't know what the right number is. We talk a lot about different types of setbacks. So, yeah, I'd just like to see more time on this.
Matt, you look like you were going to say something.
Thank you, Councilor Groves. Councilor Leach, I was just going to say, if council did choose to have another work session, we can work with our public works team to come back with a suggestion for an offset for waterways. I think one thing, as Catherine said, this is somewhat iterative and we're thinking about how we want to apply that. Another thing that didn't make it into the packet, but we'd want to consider stormwater quality facilities. That is detrimental when we have waste or, other things that enter those. But if that was council's desire, we could bring that back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Whatever we implement needs to be enforceable, or it's one more rule on the books that is just there on the books. So I believe strongly that this needs to be practical as well as spelled out. I do care and I worry about our unhoused population, but I'm also concerned about everybody in our community. And whenever a public space is tied up, it is not available to others, and public space is for all of us. So I think we need to have that in the thought process somewhere. Starting off with the distance from waterways, I concur with what Councilor Keating said. That tour that we took was very disturbing, and the amount of debris that not only was right up to the water, but actually could see in the water. I know many years ago when I was on our fire department's water rescue team, I took a boat tour upriver with our city manager, mayor, and I can't remember who all was on our jet boat. Took them upstream because you can see the camping activity, for lack of a better term, looking up under the canopy better than you can walking on a path looking down. And it's amazing how much there was even back in the 80s and 90s. This is not a new phenomenon. As far as distance from waterways, I support that wholeheartedly. I think somewhere between the high water mark and 75-foot mark makes sense. I don't know exactly where that is, but The high water mark in most years will keep any debris from entering our Willamette River that we have worked hard to clean up. And, you know, we need to be a steward of that natural resource because that water continues on downstream. I'm concerned about other jurisdictional properties. And I say that knowing that we can't have that in code. It's not going to be addressed, but I hope that we can find better ways to work with other jurisdictions. I will cite one of the worst case scenarios I've seen yet. It's clean now, fortunately, but West 11th and Beltline, there was a large encampment there with an amazing amount of garbage and debris, rodents, needles. It just goes on. And it was there for over a year. But that was between the city of Eugene, Lane County, ODOT, and private property owners. And, you know, I've been in government my whole life, or my whole adult life. But the reality is you want to slow things down, get more than one governmental entity involved, and it just feels like it screeches to a halt. So I'm hoping that we're having conversations with our governmental partners, and I'm almost out of time. That's terrible. I would also be interested to know if there is some ability to adjust timelines for established camps based on behavioral problems, and then I'll go to a second round for myself. That's a question.
So statutorily, there is a requirement for an established campsite, which the statute doesn't define, that is 72 hours. So for an established campsite, it needs to be posted. There's certain notice requirements, but that is in statute. If there are other crimes being committed, obviously we can enforce that. But just truncating the timeline, I don't believe there's a specific carve out. Is there an immediate health and safety? I don't believe so.
I'd have to go back and look.
I'm getting at threatening type behaviors. It doesn't cross the threshold of a crime, but it's still, I know my time is up. I'm just trying to finish the thought here. But I am concerned about threatening behavior and and such.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. And it is that 72 hours, it was 24 hours. And then I believe it was House Bill 3124 in the last year and a half or so changed that to 72 hours. So that's what.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to second round now. And so far I've got Councilors Zelenka, Clark, Evans, Semple, and myself. Are there others? I want to know if we need to go to 2-minute rounds.
I was just going to make a comment too.
Oh,
I can wait till the end.
If it's relevant.
Well, it was more around I heard Councilor Keating saying he was going to make a motion with the 75 feet. And then I heard Councilor Leach saying she wanted another work session. If you end up doing the motion to move forward without another work session, we could easily do some research on what the right number is and plug that into to our draft that goes to a public hearing. And then you still have the ability to change it later. So if you take the 75 feet out, I think what we would do is do some work between now and then, even if you didn't have another work session. So I just wanted to clarify that.
And also, if we can include additional information within an AIS for a public hearing, if in fact this moves to public hearing, to get additional information, because after a public hearing, you'll have at least one, if not more, work sessions. So it's not this work session or a work session after this wouldn't be your last and only chance to get information. We can add that to AIS and other.
If we had changes to make, would we have to have an additional public hearing?
Generally speaking, so there's no perfect, the question is if there's changes to the ordinance after a public hearing, and this comes up a lot. If there's changes to an ordinance, there's no bright line on that. You can make changes to an ordinance after a public hearing. That's the purpose of a public hearing, right? Is to get feedback or to get additional information and to make changes. So you certainly can make changes. The litmus test generally is, would the changes have actually brought out a different entire set of individuals that would testify to it? That's what we look at when we say you need to have another public hearing versus it's responsive to information or it's responsive to the public.
Okay, with that, we'll move into second rounds, and considering we have 5 counselors that want to speak and we have 20 minutes left plus staff response time, let's cut the second round to 2 minutes each.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest, Counselor Keating, that we not put the 75 foot in right now. Let staff investigate that and come back to it. But I would add a work session. I don't think this is right to send just to public hearing. I would suggest modifying the motion to schedule another work session and following up a public hearing. So we do have that, but we do have a deadline, July 1, 2023. So in that work session, then maybe we can get a red line of the ordinance about what we would be seeing changed based on this conversation. On the waterway conversation, to me, that is a public health issue, in part because it's an environmental impact or hazard potentially. And it's not just when a flood comes through, it's occasionally we get rain here and it would wash off and run off into the river. And so that environmental impact or pollution, I'm wondering if that can be added to the trio of public safety access and public health, safety and access as an additional rationale for moving some of these things forward. And this, along with that, in sections of the ordinance 4.816, section 4A talks about prohibiting camping if it's incompatible with the use of adjacent properties and constitutes a nuisance. So you have incompatibility and nuisance, and that's also in section 6 of that same on page 8, 7 and 8 of the ordinance. So I'm wondering if those things can be pulled in terms of rationale besides the trio of public health, safety, and access. And then can you answer that question?
Please, the rationale, I mean, these are your findings. The prohibited camping provision is unique in the sense that there are a couple, you have some intro reasonings for that. So this is your code and these are your reasonings. So you certainly could add that.
Well, more along the lines of, would that pass muster?
If
on a legal term?
It would, yes. I mean, it's more an explanation of why these code provisions are what they are. So it doesn't sound like you're adding additional regulations. It's just further explanation of why you're proposing why you have the regulations that you have.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I'm okay with adding dusk to dawn. We made it permanent. It's different. It's unique. Adding it in makes sense. Is section 5 of your attachment A, is that like a loophole that we're fixing?
That is a very odd kind of hanger out there.
Yeah, it is. It's just
and it's apparently come up. And so in speaking with Jeff Petrie, who knows all things about parking, it's just a weird loophole. Right now, there's a very clear prohibition of having an expired, and it's a parking regulation.
Yeah.
This just felt like an easy place to make this amendment. You can't have an expired registration tag, but there's nothing, it says you have to have, it's just an odd hole. But then if you don't have one or you don't have a license plate, I figured this was just an easy place.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Councilor Clark, followed by Councilor Evans.
Thank you, sir. I absolutely would be in favor of another work session on this. By 100 miles, the effects of homelessness are the most important issue to most of the people in our city, and getting to a finer grain on some of these questions, I think, is of very large importance. Catherine, I'm wondering if you would like to characterize the difference between current code and the suggested changes.
Yes, no question.
The impact. Tell us what you think
impact
is really different here in what you're proposing than what exists right now. What can you do that you couldn't do before, and what can't you do that you could have done before?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna have a really legal answer versus a more kind of abstract impact answer. I mean, it really is going from an any and all to a specifically identified. So from a practical purpose, I think it gives more specificity and clarity to where camping cannot occur. versus any is so broad, it makes it harder to explain. So from my perspective.
Will we see more camping or less? That is approved or not prohibited?
I have no way of answering that. I don't. I apologize. I mean, whether we have more or less is really based on so many things that are not regulatory. I think you've all heard Chief Skinner say, you know, that the enforcement isn't the thing that is, you know, tool around the unhoused. Neither is regulations driving whether or not we have camping. So, and I saw Chief Skinner click on.
Yeah, I'd love to hear his thoughts on that too.
Well, certainly we don't have any specific analytics today, but what I'm thinking about as I'm hearing this conversation is the number of people today that have erected some structure and call their domicile on our public lands will be the same number of people we will have tomorrow after we have these conversations and fix this. What we have today in the generality of our prohibited camping ordinance, which can feel very arbitrary and capricious for people on what is or isn't enforceable. What we're trying to do with 3115 is just to codify that and define that more specifically and anchoring that to those key areas around health and safety types of things. Certainly there's going to be some areas that won't fall into that space that might drive individuals into that area. So I'm sensitive to the volume comment that Councilor Semple made, is that as they narrowly find those places that are not prohibited, that more people will show up there. But I think the enforcement aspect of what we believe we have today and the enforcement aspect of what we believe will happen after we fix our ordinance to meet 3115 requirements will be largely the same. And I'll leave with this final comment and overwhelming. So because we still can't get to everything that we're doing now, we won't get to everything that we'll be able to do in the future.
Well, with specifics in mind and amending some of the things you said, Catherine, a couple of changes I'd be in favor of. As somebody who for 3 or 4 years did the Willamette River cleanup every year, I don't know what the right number is, but the high water mark is a minimum for me. Every fall, it's not a static thing, the water location. Every fall, it's much farther up the banks, and it washes away so much stuff into the river every single year in the fall. And I think it ought to be high water mark at a minimum. Just a week or two ago in Randy's ward, we had another propane tank explode, and how no one got killed is, I'm beside myself trying to understand how no one got killed with shrapnel in that process. We've had it before in other places. Making sure that we're addressing random fires in this process for the sake of safety is important to me too. I'd make it 10 feet from a travel lane, given the opportunity. That's a real danger. And lastly, I would not be in favor of codifying dusk to dawn, because I remember Alan's arguments when we brought it up in the first place and established it, that it was an absolutely temporary opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Evans, followed by Councilor Semple.
I'll pass, Councilor.
Thank you, Councilor Evans. Councilor Semple, followed by me.
Thank you. I think we should codify the dusk to dawn. It's working. I guess we're not ready to have a public hearing. One of the things I'm looking forward to that is the public input, because I believe this will be controversial, and I'd rather hear from the public sooner than later when we still have time to respond. So if we're not going to have a public hearing, what are we going to do to get the word out about this so we can start getting the hundreds of emails? That's a concern for me, that we have enough time. I'm really in favor of the ADA, at least the 4 feet, because I guess that's the legal amount. But when people are spilling over into the sidewalks, it's a problem for everybody who wants to use them. 75 feet from the river, I'm totally down with that. But will it also count for the Amazon channel and the other smaller stream-like things, will it also be 75 feet from that? I think that's important to address. And then our campsite definition, it used to be if you had stoves or fires, those were just illegal. What's the situation with the fire and the cooking?
So right now, the definition is any place where there's bedding, sleeping bag, or material used for bedding purposes, or any stove or fire is placed, So the proposal to delete, sorry, I don't know. The proposal to delete the reference to bedding and also is just to kind of, fire was never allowed, so the
Right.
reference to fire was confusing. I
Right.
thought, I mean, we're just trying to make it, to me, it was oddly dichotomous to reference fire, but actually no open flame is allowed. So that's why that would be deleted as well.
But how are we gonna tell somebody's camping? Can you have bedding there, and then are you camping if you have bedding?
So the way the definition would be revised would be to strike those things. So it would be a campsite means any place established or maintained for the purpose of maintaining a temporary place to live that incorporates the use of any tent, lean-to structure. So it would just it would pull out the references and kind of smooch the definition. And so it specifically referenced, now it will be referencing a tent, shack, other structure established for a place to, temporary place to live. And that will be, I didn't want to burn this conversation with so much red line, because it tends to be a little overwhelming when we're just talking about concepts. If in fact you come back for another work session and the desire is to actually see a red line ordinance, that may help you with that discussion.
Well, this says a temporary place to live. Does that count lying down to sleep?
No, and it never has, and it won't. It would not. This is not a prohibited, and I recognize that there was questions and discussions about sleeping versus camping, but this does not make unlawful somebody lying down with a sleeping bag somewhere. That is not currently unlawful, but the definition of campsite makes that confusing, because we don't have a sit, sleep, lie regulation, but the way that campsite is defined kind of clouds that a little bit. So the intent is to delete those references to make it very clear. We do not have sit, sleep, lie. If somebody is sleeping on a sidewalk, that is not unlawful under our prohibited camping regulations.
Well, that makes it pretty interesting, as long as you don't have a tent, but you have a sleeping bag and a tarp, you can sleep anywhere.
Not a tarp. I mean, now you're building a structure.
Well, if it's just wrapped around my sleeping bag, that's not okay.
I don't have an answer. I hadn't thought about.
Well, I really think it's gonna be a big concern, because this isn't so much about having a place to live day after day after day, which affects people deeply, as it is to having the ability to sleep, which has a human right, a human need. Can you still sleep anywhere?
Yeah,
Except in a park where you can't have your body in there unless it's moving after 11.
Yes.
Because I think that's one of the things people are really upset about, and people are also upset about because they need it. And I don't see this addressed.
It's not addressed because it's not regulated now, and it won't be regulated. So that's why it's the absence of the addressing it makes it unregulated. So there isn't now, and there wouldn't be after this, a prohibition on somebody sleeping anywhere that's open to the public, and somebody lying down anywhere that's open to the public. You could take a park, for example. Someone could absolutely sleep all day in a sleeping bag in a park. That's not unlawful now. It wouldn't be unlawful after this.
What would it do about the ADA protections and thing like that? Because I could sleep on the sidewalk and there'd only be 2 feet.
Well, that is a separate issue. There still needs to be maintained a minimum width. That is a separate federal ADA access law.
Great, thank you.
Councilor Evans, back
Yeah.
to you.
Just a quick note here, for the next work session. I would like to see what the cost of code enforcement is, both for, the police as well as Public Works. Do you, for Matt, for example, do you have a matrix of violations that you can address and then those that you can't address because of staffing and other costs? I know that the district attorney now is, making decisions about what, laws she's going to prosecute and what violations she's not going to prosecute based on capacity. I'm really concerned about the effect on staff and the capacity to enforce the codes that we have on the books, or even what we propose to modify based on 3115.
I'll jump in real quick and then I'll turn.
Yeah.
Just on the DA piece, none of your chapter 4 code of provisions go to the district attorney. These are all process.
Well, I was just giving that as a example.
Okay. So, yeah, those are all within municipal court. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Counselor Evans, I'd say, I'd refer to Chief Skinner, anything to do with fines or, violations of law that would be in the wheelhouse of EPD, right? Because my team doesn't work on those, neither does planning and development, that does code enforcement, has our neighborhood service officers and parking officers. Typically for us, it's not so much a question. Yeah, so it's not a question of what we do and don't do. It's more of how long it takes us to get there. So what is the kind of service level the community is experiencing because of the overwhelming need and our limited ability to respond. With that said, we have, continued to build up our staff resources to address things like camp cleanup. So in the proposed budget, we have a proposal to have a team of folks that are, permanently set up to clean the right of way. That would be something new. We've never had that before. It was always something that other staff were doing that took away from the normal focus of their jobs. But yeah, typically it's not so much about authority. It's really about, like, does it take a day for us to respond, or does it take a week?
What does that cost?
If you would want information on what the costs are, we can work on getting that to you.
Helpful for me.
Okay, I'm the last one in the queue for second round, and this is just quick. I'm looking for this discussion more in the next work session. One, I want to have more of a discussion around willful violators. And two, I would like to see how we distinguish between someone who's establishing an overnight place to rest, sleep, whatever, and for lack of a better term, someone who's establishing an ongoing homestead. And we see both in this community. And I think the latter is more problematic than the prior. I do support a person's right to sleep and reasonable accommodation. And then the last thing I'll say, as far as strips on between sidewalks and the street, cars jump curbs. I've been on many calls in my prior life where people were hit safely on a curb, even on sidewalks. So that's something to keep in mind from a health and safety standpoint as well. And with that said, quickly, Councilor Zelenka and then Councilor Semple wanted quick statements.
Yeah, one statement, one question. Letters of trespass for those watching are really important to have on file if you want the police to move people off your property or off your right of way area. Question I had is this is a modification of an ordinance, so therefore it requires a public hearing. So we need to have both a work session and then a following public hearing, but it needs to be scheduled before the deadline, which is July 1st, which means we also need 30 days before that for it to take effect. So we're kind of pushing up against scheduling, right?
Yes. And so
Or do a work session and a public hearing, and then another work session to approve the ordinance. So we have three things we have to actually.
I think where the pinch was going to come on one side of this or the other. So the time pinch was going to come having fewer work sessions before it goes to public hearing and less time after the public hearing. So the discussion today was, if this was to go to public hearing, would be an April 17th public hearing. If you want to have another work session. It will need to be after your break because you're about to go on break. So sometime in early April, we would have a work session and then it would be the May public hearing date.
Yeah.
So you just don't have a lot of, you don't have a lot of time after that. So if you want, so that's the difference.
Right. My preference is to do a work session, then a May public hearing, because there's a lot. I want us to be able to deal with what's going to go to the public hearing a little bit more than we have right now.
Okay, I see Councilor Keating's back in the queue for a second round and then Councilor Semple for a third round. Councilor Keating.
Thanks, Council President. I just wanted to indicate to colleagues that I'm picking up what you're all putting down. I hear you, and I'll be prepared to advance a motion that's likely option 3, as opposed to amending or substituting on the fly. I do want to hear from city staff about the 75-foot as opposed to 5-foot. I want to make it clear that that would be at least 75 feet is my longing. I recognize and applaud Councilor Leach's request for a suite of or for a report or more clear indication as to the suite of services that are available, including but not limited to rest stop sites, safe sleep sites, car camping, et cetera. And as Councilor Semple indicated, I too am supportive of codifying dusk to dawn. While it may have been temporary in its initial stages, times have changed, and I applaud and appreciate the success of that of the dusk to dawn program. So I'll leave that there, Council President, and just want to let colleagues know that I hear loud and clear that I was ready and willing to support that first option. I'll be making a motion for option 3 for another work session followed by a public hearing in the spring.
Thank you, Councilor Keating. Councilor Semple.
Thank you. If you can sleep without getting into trouble with this, how come people who are sleeping on a sidewalk downtown are regularly roused every 2 hours to move? Because this makes it sound like it's okay to sleep on the sidewalk without a tent and a stove and all of that. A heavy coat, lie down on the sidewalk. You should be able to stay there as long as you want. But that's not what happens.
I don't have an answer for that.
Well, I think that's really important.
Yes.
Thanks.
I'll just comment on that. You cannot block a sidewalk. It's an ADA violation.
Yeah, but if you've got an 8-foot sidewalk, you only need to leave 4 feet.
I will say that within the downtown core, there are specific, because of the downtown core and then unique features of the downtown core and it being predominantly pedestrian, there is a specific rule regarding just within the downtown core that requires an 8-foot passage.
I remember us doing that, but there's places where it's more than 8 feet. I walk downtown a lot. I see people sleeping 24 hours, different times. And it's been a concern over the years of people being outraged that you need sleep, but you can only sleep for 2 hours before you're moved.
Okay. Council Vice President, are you prepared to make a motion?
I am, Council President. Thank you. Move to direct the city manager to schedule another work session to provide the council additional time to discuss potential code amendments prior to holding a public hearing.
Second.
The motion's been moved and seconded. All in favor? That looks like unanimous. Thank you. And with that, we are adjourned.